The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Garrett Hale read it twice, folded it once, and set it on the corner of his desk where it stayed for 11 days without being touched again. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. The mountains outside his window had taught him that. They did not rush. They simply endured. And in their endurance, they outlasted everything. The letter was from a placement agency in Philadelphia. It was written in careful formal language that tried to disguise what it actually was. A transaction, a woman willing to relocate to Montana territory in exchange for the security of marriage. The agency called it a domestic arrangement of mutual benefit. Garrett called it what it was. He needed someone to keep the house. He needed an heir for the land. He did not need love. Love had already taken everything from him once, and he had no intention of standing in its path again. On the 12th day, he wrote back. He described the ranch in practical terms. 460 acres along the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Range. Good grass in summer. Hard winters. A main house with 4 rooms and a stone fireplace that kept the cold out if you kept the wood stacked. He described what he expected. Cooking, cleaning, managing the household accounts. He did not dress it up. He did not apologize for the plainness of the offer. If a woman was going to come to this land, she deserved to know exactly what she was coming to. He signed it Garrett Hale, age 43, widower. He did not mention his wife by name. He had not spoken her name aloud in 4 years. The reply came 6 weeks later. Brief, almost businesslike in its own way, which surprised him. Most of the letters the agency forwarded were full of flowery language and desperate hope. This one was neither. She wrote that she was 22 years old, that she had been trained in midwifery by her grandmother for the past 7 years and was proficient in basic medical care, that she was healthy, capable of hard work, and had no illusions about frontier life. She had read accounts of Montana territory and understood it was not Philadelphia. She did not find that discouraging. She signed it Emmeline Voss. No embellishment, no plea, no performance. Garrett read the letter standing at his desk and did not sit down until he had finished it 3 times. Then he wrote back and told her when to arrive. That was October. By November, the mountains had already begun their annual reckoning with the sky. The stagecoach out of Missoula hit the worst of the storm 40 minutes before it reached the turnoff for Hale Ranch. The driver had been watching the clouds since mid-morning, that particular charcoal gray, that old-timers in this part of Montana knew was not ordinary snow. It was the kind of weather that changed the shape of the land overnight. The kind that buried fences and froze creek beds and made everything you thought you knew about the terrain irrelevant by morning. He should have stopped in town. He knew that. But there was a schedule and there were passengers, and he made the decision he would spend the rest of the winter second-guessing. The wind hit first. Then the snow came sideways, horizontal and blinding, and the horses lost their footing on a patch of road that had turned to ice beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, and the whole rig went over on the right side with a sound like the earth splitting open. Emmeline Voss did not scream. She had been gripping the interior handle of the coach door for the past 10 minutes, feeling the way the vehicle swayed and shuddered, reading the road through the soles of her boots, the way her grandmother had taught her to read a patient's pulse through her fingertips. You pay attention to the small signals before the large ones arrive, the old woman used to say. By the time something announces itself loudly, you have already lost the advantage. When the coach went over, Emmeline tucked her chin, covered her head with both arms, and rode the fall. She hit the interior wall that was now the floor, hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, and lay still for 3 seconds, taking inventory of herself the way she had been trained. Fingers, toes, neck, spine, ribs, everything present, nothing broken. She could hear the driver outside calling out, cursing the horses. She could hear another passenger, a heavy-set man who had slept most of the journey, groaning somewhere behind her. She found the door above her head, which was now pointing at the snow-thick sky, and she pushed it open. The cold hit her face like a wall. She climbed out and stood on the side of the overturned coach and looked at the situation plainly. The driver was already working to free the horses, which were alive but tangled and frightened. The other passenger appeared unhurt, but dazed. The luggage was scattered across the road. The snow was coming down so hard she could barely see 20 feet in any direction. She had 2 choices. She could wait with the coach and hope someone came along the road before the cold became dangerous, or she could walk. She knew from the driver's commentary earlier in the journey that the turnoff to Hale Ranch was less than a mile ahead. Less than a mile in normal weather was a simple thing. In this weather in the dark that was coming on fast, it was something else entirely. But waiting on an exposed road with the temperature dropping and no shelter was its own kind of gamble, and Emmeline Voss did not like odds she could not calculate. She retrieved her bag from the wreckage. The black leather bag her grandmother had pressed into her hands on the last morning they had spent together 2 years before the old woman died. Inside it were things that mattered. The rest of her luggage, the trunk with her clothes and her books, she left. Clothes could be replaced. She told the driver where she was going. He looked at her like she had said something in a foreign language. She walked. The wind was the worst of it. Not the cold, though the cold was serious. Not the snow, though it came at her face and found every gap in her coat and scarf. It was the wind that wanted to take her sideways, that pushed against her chest like a living thing with an argument to make. She leaned into it and kept moving. Her boots found the road beneath the snow by feel. She counted her steps when the drifts got deep enough to make progress uncertain. She breathed through her nose and kept her chin down and moved. She thought about her grandmother. Not sentimentally, not the way people think about the dead when they are frightened. She thought about her practically the way the old woman would have wanted. What would she say about this situation? She would say that cold was manageable if you kept moving. She would say that fear was only useful if it sharpened your attention rather than narrowed it. She would say that a woman who could set a broken femur in a cramped bedroom by lamplight could certainly walk a mile in a snowstorm. Emmeline had set that femur. She had been 18 years old. Her hands had not shaken. She kept moving. The light appeared when she had stopped counting steps and started simply putting one foot in front of the other as an act of pure will. A pale orange glow through the white, low and steady, the kind of light that came from a window rather than a lantern on a post. She adjusted her direction and walked toward it. The house was bigger than she had expected. Not grand, nothing like the houses on Chestnut Street where she had grown up, watching from a distance, but substantial. 2 stories of dark timber and stone, with a covered porch running across the front and smoke coming hard from the chimney. There were outbuildings set back from the main house, a barn, what looked like a bunkhouse, a smaller structure she could not identify. Fenced pasture to the east, though the fence posts were the only way she could tell where the pasture ended and the rest of the world began. She walked up the porch steps. She knocked. Garrett Hale was not a man who moved slowly when something needed doing, but when he opened his front door and found a woman standing on his porch in the middle of what had become a genuine blizzard covered in snow, from her hat to her boot tops, holding a black leather bag in her right hand and looking at him with eyes that were alert and direct and entirely without panic, he stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was reasonable. He had expected someone who looked like they needed saving. She did not look like that. "Mr. Hale," she said. Her voice was steady, even. The voice of someone who had made a decision and was following through on it. "I'm Emmeline Voss." The stagecoach overturned on the road. I walked. She waited for him to step back. He stepped back. She came inside and he closed the door against the storm, and when he turned around, she was already looking at the room with a practical eye, the way someone looks at a space they are planning to work in rather than admire. She set her bag down on the bench by the door with care, careful in the specific way of someone who knew what was inside it. "You're alone," he said. "The driver stayed with the horses and the other passenger." I knew where I was going. She unwound the scarf from around her face and neck. Her cheeks were red from the cold. Her hair had come partially free from its pins, dark and damp at the edges. She looked at him directly again, and there was something in that look he could not quite name. Not defiance, not submission. Something in between. Something that said she had taken his measure and was not finished doing so. "I apologize for the state I'm in. I would like to wash my face and warm up if that is possible. Then I thought we could discuss the arrangement." "The arrangement," he repeated. "The contract." She tilted her head slightly. "That is still what this is." It was not a challenge, it was a question. A genuine one asked plainly by a woman who wanted to know where she stood before she went any further. "That is still what this is," he said. She nodded once satisfied. "Good, then we understand each other." He was about to tell her he would show her the kitchen when the door to the bunkhouse passage at the back of the house slammed open, and Fletcher came through it at a run, which was not something Fletcher did. His brother was built like a barn wall, and moved with the deliberate weight of someone who had learned long ago that most urgency was manufactured. When Fletcher ran, things were actually urgent. Garrett, his brother's voice was tight. It's Whitmore. Something went wrong in the barn. His arm, I think. Maybe worse. Garrett was already moving toward his coat on the hook by the door. What happened, he said, trying to manage the horses in the storm, got caught between the wall and the gate when one of them panicked. His arm is bent wrong and he cannot get up. Where is he? Still in the barn. He cannot walk it. Emmeline. The name felt strange in his mouth the first time he had said it. He turned back. I am sorry, I need to. She was already picking up her black bag from the bench. Show me, she said. The barn was 30 yards from the house through snow that had drifted knee-high against the path. Garrett went first, breaking trail. Emmeline followed without complaint, keeping pace. Fletcher came behind them, talking over the wind, explaining what he had seen, and Garrett listened with half his attention, while the other half was on the woman walking through the storm beside him, who had been here less than 10 minutes and was already heading toward the emergency instead of away from it. He had not asked her to come. She had not asked permission. The barn was warm by comparison to outside, the heat of the animals pressing against the cold that got in through the gaps in the boards. It smelled of hay and horse and the sharp metallic edge of blood. 3 ranch hands were standing in a loose cluster near the far stall, and in the middle of them, sitting against the stall wall with his back straight and his face the color of old chalk, was Whitmore. He was 31 years old and had worked for Garrett for 6 years. He was not a man who made noise about pain. The fact that he was sitting there very still and breathing through his teeth in short controlled bursts told Garrett everything he needed to know about how serious it was. Emmeline moved past Garrett without a word. She crouched in front of Whitmore and set her bag on the barn floor and opened it with the efficiency of someone who had done this in worse light, in worse conditions, with less time. She looked at his arm first, with her eyes tracing the line of it from shoulder to wrist, without touching it yet. Then she looked at his face. I am Emmeline, she said. I am going to find out what has happened, and I am going to help you. I need you to stay as still as you can. Can you tell me where the pain is worst? Whitmore looked past her at Garrett, a reflex, the look of a man checking to see if what was happening had been sanctioned. Garrett gave him a single nod. Whitmore looked back at the woman in front of him. Below the elbow, he said. When I tried to move at something, he stopped, breathed. It felt wrong. Yes, she said simply. It is, but I can fix it. She looked back at Garrett, not for permission, for something specific. I need 2 men to hold him, strong ones, one at the shoulders, one at the hips. They need to hold absolutely still no matter what they hear. Can you do that? Garrett looked at Fletcher. Fletcher nodded. He pointed to one of the other hands, a quiet man named Aldous, who was built from the same general material as the barn door. I also need something clean, Emmeline said, already withdrawing items from her bag with practiced speed. Cloth, a length of thin wooden rod, a brown glass bottle. Clean cloth, preferably boiled, but I will work with what there is. And whiskey if you have it. In the tack room, Fletcher said. Get it. Fletcher went. No hesitation. Garrett registered this without analyzing it. She had said it the way you say things when you know they will be done. Garrett took position at Whitmore's shoulders. Aldous moved to the hips. Emmeline looked at them both with careful eyes, checking their positioning, adjusting Aldous with a hand on his arm so that he was anchored correctly. When I say hold, she said, you hold. No matter what happens, even if he yells, especially if he yells, you let go and you risk making this worse. Do you understand? Both men said yes. She looked at Whitmore. Her voice changed, still calm but softer, the kind of voice that cuts through pain because it sounds like it comes from somewhere outside of it. I am going to count to 3, she said. On 3, take a deep breath. The worst part will be over before you finish letting it out. Are you ready? He was not ready. You could see it in his face, in the way his jaw was clamped and his eyes were fixed on some middle distance that had nothing in it. But he said yes because she asked him like she believed he could do it. 1, she said. Her hands moved to the arm, her left hand proximal, her right hand distal, the grip precise and firm, but not harsh. 2. She felt the break without looking at it. Her eyes stayed on his face. 3. The sound of the reduction was something Garrett would not forget. A deep, wet click. It seemed too large to have come from inside a human arm. Whitmore's roar shook dust from the rafters above them. The horses in the stalls shifted and stomped. Garrett held with everything he had. Aldous held, and Emmeline's hands kept moving without hesitation, smooth and deliberate, wrapping the arm against the splint she had already assembled, binding it with the clean cloth Fletcher had returned with, just in time, her fingers working in patterns she clearly did not have to think about anymore. When it was done, the barn was quiet except for the storm outside and Whitmore's ragged breathing. Emmeline sat back on her heels. She looked at her work for a moment. Then she looked at Whitmore. "The bones are aligned," she said. "You will need to keep it completely still for at least 2 weeks. If you use that arm before the fracture has started to knit, you risk a break that will not heal cleanly. I mean that. Completely still." Whitmore stared at her. "Who are you?" he said. And then, as if remembering there was a world outside of the last 5 minutes, "Where did you come from, Philadelphia?" she said. She picked up her bag and stood. "But I walked from the road." Later, after Whitmore was settled in the bunkhouse with the whiskey and Fletcher watching over him after the other hands had dispersed back to their work, with the particular quiet of men who have witnessed something they have not yet found words for, Garrett stood at the kitchen stove and made coffee. He was not sure what else to do. Emmeline sat at the kitchen table and had not said anything since they came back inside. She was warming her hands around a cup of water he had heated for her. Her black bag closed and set beside her chair, and she was looking at the grain of the wooden table with an expression he could not read. She looked tired, not defeated, just tired in the honest way of someone who had spent something real. He set the coffee on the table and sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You have done that before," he said. It was not a question. "Many times," she said. "Fractures are common in obstetric work. You would be surprised. And my grandmother took any case that came to the door. Farm injuries, logging accidents. She believed a trained hand was a trained hand, and you used it where it was needed. You set it before the bone could swell," he said. He had seen broken bones before. He knew enough to know what she had done and why the timing mattered. She looked at him. Something shifted slightly in her expression, a kind of recalibration, as if she had revised something she had been assuming about him. "Yes," she said. "After swelling sets in, it becomes considerably more complicated." Silence. "You came a long way," he said. "I did. In weather that most people would not have chosen. I was not given much of a choice about the weather." She lifted the cup, set it back down. "I was given a choice about whether to wait for someone to come along the road or to keep moving. I chose to keep moving. That is the only part of it I had any say in." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had arrived out of a blizzard with snow on her coat and blood on her hands and a bag full of things she knew how to use. Who had walked into his barn and taken control of a situation before he had finished thinking about how to approach it. Who was sitting at his kitchen table at 9 o'clock on a November night in Montana Territory, talking about her choices as though choices were simply the material you worked with. "The contract," he said. "Yes. You still want to go through with it?" She looked at him steadily. "You still want to go through with it?" she said. It was the same deflection, the same question returned to sender, and he understood that she was not going to answer before he did. "I put the offer out," he said. "I am not in the habit of taking back what I put out." "Neither am I," she paused, "but I want you to understand what you are getting. I am not ornamental, Mr. Hale. I am not quiet, and I am not particularly biddable. And I have been doing skilled work for long enough that being told what to do by someone who knows less than I do about a thing tends to sit poorly with me. I will keep your house, and I will learn your land, and I will be a fair and honest partner to you. But I will not be managed." She said all of this without heat, without apology, with the same tone she had used when she told the men to hold. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "Whitmore is one of the best hands I have ever employed," he said. "He has worked for me 6 years. I have never once had to tell him twice." She waited. "I do not think I misunderstood what you were saying," he said. He stood and retrieved the contract from his desk drawer and brought it to the table. It was 2 pages handwritten by the agency covering the terms of the arrangement. He had already signed it. He pushed it across the table to her. She read it, all of it. He could tell she was reading it, not skimming, her eyes moving slowly down each line. When she reached the end, she looked up. "The terms are acceptable," she said. "Good." She took the pen he offered and signed her name. Emmeline Voss. Clear and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write with deliberateness. Garrett picked up the contract, folded it, and returned it to the desk. When he came back to the kitchen, she was still sitting at the table, but she had turned slightly in her chair and was looking at the door that led to the hallway. The door that was always latched from the outside. He had not noticed her looking until she noticed him noticing. She turned back to the table without comment. But something had shifted in the room. Something small and specific. The kind of shift you feel rather than see the way you feel a change in the wind direction before you can name what is different about the air. He showed her the room that would be hers. Small, clean, a window that faced east so it would catch the morning light. A bed frame with a good mattress, a washstand, a dresser with a small mirror that had a crack running diagonally through one corner. He had not decorated it. It had not occurred to him that this was something he might have done. She looked at it with clear eyes, taking stock. "It is fine," she said. He brought her extra blankets because the upstairs ran cold. He told her the pump was at the left of the kitchen sink and that the water ran copper tasting for a minute in the morning until the pipes cleared. He told her the stove took split pine to start and seasoned oak to hold the heat, and that the wood box beside it was replenished by whoever came in first in the morning, which was usually him. She listened to all of this, nodded, asked one question: where were the medical supplies, if any? He told her there were none. The nearest doctor was in Missoula, 40 miles. She nodded again. This did not surprise her. "Good night, Mr. Hale," she said. "Good night." He went back downstairs. He sat at his desk and looked at the fire in the hearth and did not think about any particular thing for a while. Outside, the storm was still working at the corners of the house, looking for a way in the way storms always did out here. The house held the way it always had. After a while, he went down the hall and checked that the door to the closed room was latched securely the way he always did before he went to bed. He did not know that she had already been back downstairs. She had not been able to sleep. This was not unusual for her. New places had always required a period of adjustment, her body taking time to trust the sounds of a different house to catalog the creaks and settling noises and wind patterns before it would release into rest. She had learned to use these wakeful hours productively rather than fight them. She came downstairs quietly and went to the kitchen for water and stood at the window for a while watching the snow. The blizzard had slowed to something more reasonable. The moon had come out behind the cloud cover and was lighting the pasture to the east in a flat pale blue that was almost beautiful in the severe way that this land seemed to be beautiful without invitation or softness. She was turning to go back upstairs when she saw the door. It was not remarkable in itself, a door in a hallway, but it was the only interior door in the house that was latched from the outside rather than from within a small metal hook and eye set, and the difference registered with her the way small inconsistencies always did. Things that did not quite fit. She had been trained to notice them. She did not open it. That was not something she would do in someone else's house, not to a door that was clearly meant to stay closed. But she stood in front of it for a moment in the dark hallway, with the winter quiet pressing in around her, and she thought about a man who kept a room locked from the outside, not to keep something in, to keep himself out. She went back upstairs. She lay down on the narrow bed and listened to the house settle around her, and let herself think about the day's events the way she always did before sleep, tallying them, filing them, extracting what was useful and releasing what was not. Whitmore's arm. The quality of the break, the speed of the reduction, the way the bone had seated. Good, clean. He would heal well if he followed instructions. Garrett Hale. The way he had moved when his man was hurt. No wasted motion, no theatrics. Efficient and calm in the way of someone who understood what was being asked of him and had the self-discipline to deliver it without flinching. The contract. The way he had placed the signed document in front of her without ceremony or performance. A man who meant what he put his name to. The door in the hallway. She let that one sit without analyzing it. Some things were not ready to be understood yet. You learn that in medical work. Not everything presented its whole story at once. Some things revealed themselves over time through trust, through proximity, through the slow accumulation of small moments that were separately unremarkable and together conclusive. She was almost asleep when she remembered something Fletcher had said in the barn, talking to one of the other hands, probably not meaning for her to hear it. She had been focused on Whitmore and had only caught a fragment. He had said she has got Margaret's hands. She had not asked who Margaret was. She already understood that she was going to find out. Outside, the snow had stopped entirely, and the Montana sky above Hale Ranch was opening up star by star, the way it did after a storm, vast and indifferent and breathtaking, and the kind of sky that reminded you that whatever small human drama was unfolding beneath it, the world was considerably larger than the story you were standing inside. Emmeline Voss closed her eyes. She had made it through the first night. Tomorrow, she thought, would be the real beginning. She was right. She just did not know yet how much the beginning would cost her or how much it would give back. Outside, the last of the clouds moved through. The stars came out hard and bright and cold above the dark Montana mountains, and the ranch sat quiet in the snow, and inside one of its rooms, a man stared at the ceiling without sleeping. And inside another, a woman finally slept, her black bag on the floor beside her bed, her grandmother's hands folded on her chest, still and steady, as everything she had been trained to become. Winter in Montana did not ease into itself the way winters did in the East. It did not arrive politely, test the air, and gradually make its intentions known. It came all at once and stayed without apology, and it asked of everyone who lived beneath it a single question repeated daily in 100 different forms. Are you serious about being here? And it waited for the answer not in words but in actions, in the woodpile and the water barrel, and the pre-dawn darkness of a barn that needed tending regardless of what the thermometer said. Emmeline Voss decided in the first week that she was serious about being here. She did not announce this. She simply got up before the light and found out where things were and began doing them. The stove, the water pump with its copper-tasting first minute that she learned to let run into the slop bucket rather than the drinking pail. The chickens, which lived in a small hutch attached to the southeast corner of the barn and required grain in the morning and checking in the evening for eggs that the cold could crack if left too long. She made mistakes. She made them, quietly corrected them without drama, and did not make the same one twice. Garrett watched this from a careful distance. He had expected to need to teach her things. He had prepared himself for the particular patience that required. What he found instead was a woman who watched everything once and then did it, who asked questions only when she had exhausted the information available to her through direct observation, and who had an unsettling habit of already being at work at whatever needed doing before he had finished thinking about whether to ask her. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was something. The first call came on a Thursday in late November, 3 weeks after Emmeline arrived. A man rode up to the ranch in the early afternoon, his horse lathered despite the cold, and asked at the door for the doctor. Garrett told him there was no doctor. The man's face did what faces did when they received this information in an emergency, a rapid private negotiation between what he needed to be true and what was actually true. His wife, he said, she had been laboring since the night before. Something was wrong. He had ridden to Missoula and found the doctor gone on a call that had taken him north 2 days ago, no telling when he would be back. Emmeline appeared in the doorway behind Garrett. She had been in the kitchen. She had her bag in her hand. "How far?" she said. The man blinked. "Ma'am, your farm, how far?" 7 miles, maybe 8. She looked at the sky. The light was flat and white, the kind that preceded snow. She had 4 hours of reasonable visibility, maybe 5. "Saddle my horse," she said to Garrett. Then she looked at the man. "Tell me about the labor. When did the pains start? How far apart are they now? Has there been any bleeding?" The man answered. She listened with her eyes on his face, reading the information beneath the information, the things he did not know enough to say. She asked 2 more questions. Then she nodded. "Let us go," she said. Garrett saddled her horse. He stood in the barn doorway and watched her ride out with the man across the frozen pasture toward the tree line and the gray sky beyond it, her black bag strapped across her back, her spine straight against the cold. Fletcher appeared beside him. "You going to follow her?" Fletcher said. Garrett looked at the sky, looked at the direction she had gone, thought about the 7 miles and the light that was already starting to change. "No," he said. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. "She knows what she is doing." "I know she does." "Then why do you look like that?" Garrett went back inside without answering. It was not a question he was prepared to examine. She came back after dark. She came back without incident, which he had told himself was the most likely outcome. She put her horse up herself, which he discovered when he went to check, and found it already done the animal fed and watered and brushed her saddle on its rack. She came in through the back door and stood at the kitchen pump and washed her hands for a long time with the methodical thoroughness of someone cleaning away something more than dirt. "Well," he said. "Boy," she said. "Cord was wrapped. I was able to reposition. Both are fine." She dried her hands and turned around. Her face was composed, but there were shadows under her eyes that had not been there that morning. The mother's name is Vera. She is 24 years old, and this was her third delivery in 4 years. She needs rest that she probably will not get. She sat down at the kitchen table. He put coffee in front of her. She looked at the coffee, then she looked at him. Something moved across her face briefly, too fast to name. Then it was gone. "Thank you," she said. She drank the coffee. She did not say anything else for a while. Neither did he. The fire in the hearth said enough for both of them, speaking in the low language of burning wood, and outside the snow that had been threatening all day finally came down soft and steady, and the ranch settled into its winter quiet. It was, Garrett thought, not the worst evening he had spent in this kitchen in 4 years. He set that thought aside the way he set aside most things that moved toward territory he had decided to leave alone. By December, the town knew about her. Not the full truth of her. Not yet. What they knew was that there was a woman at Hale Ranch who could do what no one else within 40 miles could do, and in a place where the nearest doctor was a full day's ride in good weather and considerably more in bad. That was not a small thing. They came with fractures and fevers, with labors that had gone on too long and wounds that had not closed right. A boy of 9 who had gotten his hand caught in a piece of equipment and lost the tips of 2 fingers, the stumps ragged and already showing the early signs of infection. An elderly man with a chest that sounded like a creek bed filling with gravel, who turned out to have pneumonia that she treated with what she had and told his family would require a month of strict rest and careful watching. Emmeline treated them all. She kept a record in a small brown notebook she carried in her bag, each patient's name and complaint and what she had done and what she recommended. She ran low on certain supplies within 6 weeks and wrote a careful list and gave it to Garrett. He looked at the list. He looked at her. He ordered everything on it. The town's response was not uniform. Some came to her with an open relief that was almost painful to witness, the gratitude of people who had been one bad winter away from having no recourse at all and suddenly found themselves less alone in that vulnerability. These people brought things in return: a jar of preserved plums, a length of good wool fabric, a ham at Christmas that appeared on the porch without a note, but which Emmeline correctly attributed to the family of the 9-year-old boy. Others watched her with the particular suspicion reserved for things that did not fit the established categories. She was too young to be that capable. She was from a city, which meant she was soft, which her evident lack of softness then required explanation. She had come as a mail-order bride, which carried its own freight of assumption that her behavior did not support, and people who have built a picture in their minds do not always appreciate evidence that requires them to redraw it. She heard the whispers. She did not react to them. She had been raised in a city that ran on the currency of reputation, and she knew better than most what whispers were actually made of. They were made of ignorance and proximity, and the human need to make sense of unfamiliar things by reducing them. You did not fight whispers with arguments. You outlasted them with evidence. She kept working. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Garrett did not observe it beyond a quiet acknowledgement that it had arrived. This was not bitterness, or at least not only that. It was the habit of a man who had learned that some days are better approached as simply another day, that the weight of specific dates was a weight you could choose not to pick up if you were careful. Emmeline made a small thing of it. She had acquired sugar somehow and made something with it that involved the dried apples she had found in the cellar, and she set it on the table without comment, and Garrett ate it, and it was the best thing he had eaten in longer than he could honestly remember. He said nothing about this at the time. Fletcher, who had been invited to dinner and was not in the habit of leaving things unsaid, used the word extraordinary twice, before Emmeline told him not unkindly that he was embarrassing her. Fletcher grinned. He had taken to Emmeline Voss with an uncomplicated warmth that Garrett had observed from a careful remove. Fletcher had always been the easier of the 2 brothers with people. He moved toward them rather than away. He had not lost what Garrett had lost. After dinner, when Fletcher had gone and the kitchen was clean and the fire was low, Garrett sat at his desk, and Emmeline sat at the table with her brown notebook entering the week's cases in her small, even handwriting. The lamplight was warm. The storm that had been building for 2 days had not yet arrived. The house was quiet in a way that had a different quality now than the quiet of before her arrival. Not empty, something else. Something he chose not to examine too directly. He was aware of her in the room. He had been aware of her in most rooms for several weeks and had been managing this awareness with the disciplined inattention of a man who knows what certain feelings lead to and has decided they lead somewhere he will not go. He was proficient at it. He had had 4 years of practice. "Garrett," she said. He looked up. She did not look up from her notebook. "The Pierce family, north of town, about 12 miles. I know them. Nora Pierce is 8 months along. She told me when she came in last week. She has had 2 previous losses, one at 7 months, one at birth. She is frightened." Emmeline paused, made a notation. "I want to check on her weekly from here through delivery. I will need the horse." "You have the horse whenever you need it." She looked up then, briefly. "I know. I am telling you so you do not wonder where I have gone." She went back to her notebook. He went back to his desk. But the room had changed slightly in the way rooms did sometimes after certain words were spoken in them, and Garrett sat with his papers and did not read them, and thought about a woman who told him where she was going so he would not wonder, and the particular way that small gesture settled inside his chest in a place he had told himself was closed. January brought the hardest cold of the winter, and with it the kind of work that tested the ranch in fundamental ways. Pipes froze. Livestock needed constant attention. A section of fence in the north pasture came down under the weight of ice, and the cattle that wandered through it had to be tracked and returned over 3 days of temperatures that made every hour outside a negotiation with your own endurance. Emmeline helped, not as someone filling a role assigned to her, as someone who saw what needed doing and did it. She was not built for the physical labor of ranch work the way the hands were, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she was not fragile either, and she had a quality that Garrett had come to recognize as worth more than physical strength in certain situations. She did not panic. When things went wrong, which in a Montana January they regularly did, she assessed and responded and kept moving. She did not compound the problem with emotion. One morning in the second week of January, a heifer in the north barn went into a difficult labor, and Emmeline was there because she had been up since 4 with a sick calf in the same barn, and she assisted the delivery with the same practical competence she brought to everything, and the calf lived when it would likely not have, and afterwards she washed her hands and went back to the house and made breakfast as though none of it had been particularly remarkable. Garrett stood in the barn doorway and watched the heifer nose her new calf, and thought about the woman now in his kitchen, and thought about the word he had heard Fletcher use once when he did not think Garrett could hear him. Fletcher had said he does not know what he has got. Garrett had not responded at the time. He was not sure Fletcher was wrong. The night that changed things between them was in February. He would mark it afterward as the moment when the distance he had maintained with such deliberate effort became something he had to actively reconstruct rather than simply preserve. For that night, the distance had been a wall he stood behind. After it, the wall was still there, but it had become something he was building rather than something he was resting against, and building requires an acknowledgement that the structure is not permanent. It was the Pierce delivery. Nora Pierce went into labor on a Tuesday night during a storm that was not as severe as the November blizzard, but was bad enough. Her husband rode to the ranch in the dark. Emmeline was ready in 7 minutes. Garrett drove the wagon himself because the roads were ice, and he did not want her navigating them alone in the dark, and he told himself this was a practical decision and nothing else. The Pierce house was a 2-room cabin, low-ceilinged and overheated from the fire they had built up in anticipation, the windows running with condensation. Emmeline went in, and Garrett waited outside on the covered porch with Nora's husband, a quiet man named Elias who had the look of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had forgotten what it felt like not to be. They waited. Garrett did not speak. He had nothing useful to say. He stood and let the cold keep him awake and listened to the sounds from inside the cabin and thought about the fact that there had been a time when he had stood outside a room like this and waited, and the waiting had ended in a way he did not let himself remember. He remembered it anyway. He always did in these situations. His wife's name had been Margaret. She had died 6 hours after their son was born, the son who had also not survived. The doctor had said it was a hemorrhage. He had delivered this information quickly and with the battered pragmatism of a man who had said it many times. It happened, he had said. Even in good deliveries, there was nothing that could have been done. Garrett had never entirely believed him. He stood on the Pierce porch and breathed the cold air and held himself very still the way he had learned to do when memory came at him with this kind of force. Inside the cabin, someone said something in a low voice. Then there was silence. Then a sound that was the oldest sound in the world. The new voice of a person arriving. Garrett closed his eyes. When he opened them, Emmeline was in the doorway. She was looking at him. Her hair had come loose from its pins and there was a tiredness around her eyes. But she was standing straight and her face was doing something he had not seen it do before. Not the composed professional expression she wore when she was working. Something underneath that. Something that she had perhaps not quite managed to put away in time before she opened the door. A girl, she said. Healthy. Nora as well. Elias made a sound that a grown man in this part of the country would not usually make in front of other people, and pushed past Emmeline into the cabin, and Emmeline stepped onto the porch and let the door close behind her. She looked at Garrett. The lantern light from the window was catching the side of her face, and there was something in her eyes, a reflection of what was in his, or close enough to it, that the recognition moved through him before he could stop it. She had been afraid too. For Nora. For the outcome. She had stood inside that cabin and carried the weight of 2 lives in her hands, and she had brought them through, and now she was standing on a porch in the February cold, and the relief was still moving through her, and she had not finished putting it away. He had not seen her unguarded before. He had not known until this moment how much that would affect him. The realization arrived with the force of something he had not prepared for. He did not show it. He was a man who had spent 4 years not showing things, and he was proficient at it in ways that had cost him more than he could calculate. But something shifted in him that night. Something that had been fixed came loose, and he spent the entire drive home in the dark cold putting it carefully back into place, brick by brick, telling himself that what he had felt on that porch was the product of the night and the cold and the memory of Margaret and would look like nothing in the morning. In the morning, it looked like everything. He was colder to Emmeline that week than he had been since the first days. Not cruel, never that, but pulled back in a way she would notice, in a way she had earned the right to expect better than she noticed. He could tell she noticed because she was not a woman who missed things. She simply adjusted and gave him the distance without comment and kept doing her work and did not ask him for an explanation, which made it worse. March arrived with a thaw that softened the roads and a restlessness in the town that came with the end of being enclosed. People emerged from their winter like the land itself, cautiously testing the air. It was also the month that Vera rode out to the ranch with news that rearranged everything. Vera was not a woman who wasted trips or words. She sat at the kitchen table and told Emmeline plainly what she had heard. A man had been in the saloon 2 nights running, well-dressed, from back east by the sound of him. He had been talking to people, she said, in the specific way that was not conversation, but was the careful seeding of a story into the groundwater of a small community. He had said he knew the woman at Hale Ranch, that she had come from a good family in Philadelphia that she had disgraced, that there had been a situation involving a man of standing, and the details were not something he could speak about in plain terms, but that anyone considering trusting her with their family, their family, their children, might want to think carefully about what they actually knew. He had not used her name every time. He had not needed to. In a town this size, with a woman who had arrived less than 5 months ago, there was only one referent. Vera told her all of this with the directness of someone who did not believe it and wanted Emmeline to know she did not believe it. He has been careful, Vera said. Nothing you could take directly to Reverend Greer. Just the shadow of a thing. Emmeline thanked her. After Vera left, she stood in the kitchen for a long while. The shadow of a thing. She knew the shape of that. She knew it intimately in the way that only a person who had been destroyed by exactly that mechanism could know it. Not accusations, implications, suggestions that required no proof because they were not stated as facts. They were stated as concern, as reluctance, as the performance of a man protecting a community he cared about. His name was Aldrich Crane, merchant from Philadelphia. She had known him for 3 years before he showed her what he was. She had refused his offer of marriage, which was not really an offer but a transaction he had assumed she would be grateful to accept. And in response, he had done what men like Crane did when refused by people they considered beneath them. He had built a story and released it into the city's social water supply and watched it spread. She had left Philadelphia partly because of it, and now he was here. She sat at the kitchen table with her brown notebook in front of her, and she thought about Crane the way she thought about complicated medical situations. What did she have available? What were the realistic outcomes? What was the correct order of operations? She did not think about confronting him directly. Not yet. Not until she understood more about what he knew and what he wanted, because men like Crane always wanted something specific, and knowing what it was gave you an advantage. That direct confrontation before you had the information would cost you. She opened the notebook to a clean page. She began writing a letter to Philadelphia. Her grandmother had taught her that the best defense was a thorough record kept over time. She had been keeping one. Since the first incident in Philadelphia 2 years ago, she had documented dates and names and the specific pattern of Crane's method, which was consistent enough that it constituted a profile rather than a series of separate incidents. She had contacted two of the other women before she left Philadelphia. There were more. She wrote to one of them now, a woman named Dorothea Marsh. She wrote carefully, giving enough detail to convey the urgency without saying more in a letter than needed to be said. She asked for what Dorothea could provide. She explained what she intended to do with it. Then she folded the letter and sealed it and set it on the corner of the desk where she would take it to town in the morning. She was not a woman who made threats she could not deliver on. What she had built over 2 years of careful record-keeping was not a threat. It was an accounting. And Aldrich Crane was about to learn the difference between a woman who was afraid of him and a woman who had been waiting with considerable patience for the right moment to present the bill. April in Montana arrived not as a season, but as a negotiation. The snow did not simply stop. It retreated by degrees, pulling back from the southern faces of hills, first leaving dark, wet earth exposed in patches that widened daily, then held, then widened again. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Hale Ranch broke its ice in the second week of the month with a sound like distant cannon fire that woke Emmeline at 4 in the morning and brought her to the window in time to see nothing but darkness and to hear the water moving again beneath it, freed and purposeful. She stood at the window for a while. She had been thinking since the night Vera had come, thinking about Crane, about the letters, about what was building and what it would require from her when it arrived. But she had also been thinking about other things, about the ranch and what it had become to her in 5 months, about the man who ran it, about the distance he had put between them after the Pierce porch and the quality of that distance, which was not the same as the distance he had maintained before that night. Before that night, the distance had been neutral, the ordinary space between two people who did not yet know each other well. After it, the distance had a temperature. It was the distance of a man who was keeping himself away from something on purpose, and the purpose was visible to anyone paying attention. Emmeline was always paying attention. She had let him have the distance. This was not patience in the passive sense. It was the patience of a person who understood that some things could not be rushed without being broken and who valued the thing enough to wait for it to be ready. But she had also been watching because watching was how she understood things, and what she had been watching over the past 6 weeks had told her that Garrett Hale was not moving away from the February porch. He was moving toward it slowly in the incremental way of a man who mistrusts his own momentum. He was moving toward it in the way he handed her things now, with a moment's extra contact that had not been there before. In the way he sometimes looked up from whatever he was doing and watched her for a second or two before looking away. In the small adjustments of priamity that were not accidental. He was getting there. She was going to let him get there at his own pace. What she had not expected was the particular morning in early April that shifted something in the quality of her own waiting. She had been in the kitchen before dawn, starting the stove, going through the ordinary motions of the morning that she had learned well enough now that she could do them in near darkness. The coffee was on, and she was looking out the east window at the pasture beginning to emerge from the dark, the sky above the mountains going from black to the specific deep blue that comes just before color when Garrett came in from the barn. He was carrying something. He came through the back door and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony the way he did most things. It was a small bunch of dried wildflowers, the kind that grew in the high meadows in summer, and that she had noticed once months ago in passing, commenting on nothing more than their color, and that had been the end of it. She had not thought he was listening. He had been listening. He stood at the sink and washed his hands with his back to her and said nothing about the flowers. And she stood at the stove and said nothing about them either, and the coffee came ready, and she poured 2 cups and set his on the counter by the sink, the way she had learned he preferred it. And they stood in the kitchen in the early April morning, with the day beginning outside the window, and the flowers on the table between them, and neither of them spoke about any of it. But something had changed. Something had been offered and received in the space between words in the language of small acts that two people develop when they have been sharing a house and a life long enough that the gestures begin to say what neither of them has yet found a way to say directly. Emmeline looked at the flowers and then looked at the window and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still held tight. She was not afraid of what was happening. She had been afraid for a long time of many things. She was not afraid of this. She began charging for her services in the first week of April. She had not charged before. She had accepted what people brought her, the preserved plum and the wool and the ham, the small offerings of a community that understood reciprocity but could not always express it in cash. Now she told people quietly and without apology that she was establishing a formal fee, not large. She had calculated carefully what the community could bear and what she needed and had set her number at the intersection of those two things. She told each patient when they came to her or when she went to them. She kept the notebook. Some people paid immediately. Some needed time. She extended time without hesitation and without concern. She knew they were good for it. She had been living among these people for 5 months, and she knew which families kept their word and which ones struggled and which ones would trade labor for care if cash was genuinely not available. And she accepted all of it and kept her accounts with precision. She kept the money in a small tin in her room. She did not tell Garrett what she was doing with it. This was not deception. It was the particular privacy of a person who has decided to solve a problem and does not want the person the problem affects to feel the weight of being solved for. She had considered telling him. She had decided against it on the grounds that Garrett Hale was a man who would refuse help offered directly, not out of pride exactly, but out of the deep-rooted conviction of a certain kind of man that his difficulties were his to carry and that allowing another person to carry them was a form of failure he could not accept. She would present him with the result, not the process. She had learned about the tax debt from Fletcher in February mentioned in passing, without Fletcher realizing she did not already know. 3 seasons behind, he had said to someone else, thinking she was out of earshot. Another difficult year, and the bank in Missoula would have questions Garrett could not comfortably answer. She had been keeping the tin ever since. Crane came to the ranch on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of April. Emmeline saw him right up through the kitchen window. She set down what she was doing and stood at the window for a moment and let herself feel what she felt, which was the cold, particular fear she always felt when he appeared, the fear that had been her constant companion for 2 years, the fear that knew him well and had good reasons to exist. She felt it and she acknowledged it, and she set it aside with the same motion she used to set aside everything that was not useful in the moment. She was not the same woman he had laughed at in Philadelphia. She went to the front door and opened it before he reached the porch steps. He stopped when he saw her in the doorway. He had not changed. This was its own kind of information. Men who had done what he had done sometimes wore it afterward, carried it in the way they moved or held their faces. Aldrich Crane looked precisely as he had looked in Philadelphia, well-dressed, well-fed, carrying himself with the ease of a man who had never once in his life been made to answer for anything. "We should talk," he said. "We can talk here," she said. "I will not invite you inside." Something moved behind his eyes, but his face stayed arranged. He was good at his face. She had learned this about him a long time ago. "I've only been honest with people in this town," he said, "about what I know. A man has a responsibility to the communities he visits. You have no responsibility to anyone but yourself. Say what you came to say." He looked at her in the doorway of a house that was not hers by birth, and he seemed to be making an assessment he had not finished making yet. His eyes went to the interior of the house, to the life visible through the open door, and something in his calculations shifted. "I have spoken with people in Missoula," he said, and his voice had changed. The affable surface was present, but something colder was moving beneath it. Financial things, public record things. He paused, letting that settle. "Garrett Hale is 3 seasons behind on his territory tax. A man hears things. I have resources. I could make that problem very simple. He looked at her directly. If. She knew what the if was. He did not bother finishing the sentence. She stood with it for a moment. The weight of it, the specific and horrible architecture of what he was offering, the way it was designed to reach her, the way it took the thing she had come to care about and turned it into a lever. She let herself understand it fully, and then she looked at him and spoke. You came here believing I would trade one kind of captivity for another to protect a man who does not need my protection in that way. She kept her voice even, level. You came here believing that I am still the woman you could frighten in Philadelphia. You are wrong on both counts. He raised an eyebrow. Emmeline, I have been keeping records for 2 years, she said. You know this because I had told you before I left Philadelphia and you did not believe me. I need you to believe me now. She reached into her coat pocket and produced the notebook. Not opening it, simply letting him see it. Names, dates, the pattern of what you do and how you do it and who witnessed it. I have been in correspondence with 3 women in Philadelphia since January. One of them has been gathering what I could not gather from this distance. What they have collected is currently in the hands of a magistrate. She let that land. You are going to go to Reverend Greer, she said. Today, you are going to withdraw what you have said in this town. Publicly, you are going to acknowledge that you spoke without accurate knowledge. And then you are going to leave Cresthaven and not return. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. She could see him measuring the distance between what she claimed and what she actually had, running the calculation the way he always did, looking for the gap where the bluff lived. He was looking for fear in her eyes because fear was the gap he needed, and fear was the thing she had trained herself over 2 years of very deliberate practice to keep where he could not see it. He did not find it. You would have been formidable in a different life, he said at last. It was not a compliment. It was the language of a man making peace with the fact that he had lost. I am formidable in this one, she said. She heard boots behind her. Garrett came up from somewhere behind the house and stopped at the foot of the porch steps. He looked at Crane. He looked at Emmeline. He took in the notebook in her hand and the quality of the space between the two of them. And he stood at the foot of the steps in the way a man stands when he has arrived somewhere and is waiting to understand what is needed. Not to fight, not to rescue, to be present for whatever came next. Crane looked at Garrett for a moment. Then he looked back at Emmeline. Some final piece of his calculation completed itself behind his eyes, and she watched the decision arrive in his face, the small, hard settling of a man accepting a conclusion he did not like. Greer, he said. Today, she said. He turned and walked back to his horse without another word. Garrett came up onto the porch. He stood beside her, and they both watched Crane ride down the road toward town. Neither of them spoke until the sound of hoofbeats had faded into the distance and the road was empty, and the April afternoon was quiet around them. Then Emmeline let out a breath that she had been holding for a long time. Her hands were trembling. She let them. She was done pretending in this moment that none of it had cost her anything. Garrett looked at her hands. He looked at her face. He did not ask if she was all right because it was plain on her face that she was not all right in the way she was generally not all right, which was to say that she was standing upright and had done what she went to do, and the trembling was the result of having held things in check rather than evidence of damage. He put his back against the wall beside her the same way he stood when he was thinking rather than when he was acting, and they stood together on the porch in the spring afternoon, and the distance that had been between them since February was still present, but it had changed in character. It was thinner, more permeable. Something had moved through it. He told me about the tax debt, she said. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That is public record in Missoula. I know. She turned her head and looked at him. I have been working on that since April started. I have a tin upstairs with most of what is needed. I was going to tell you when I had the full amount. I am telling you now because you should know before you hear something from him that makes it sound different than it is. He looked at her. She looked back. The silence between them was not the silence of before. It was not the silence of two people who had not yet found their way to each other. It was the silence of two people who were very close to arriving somewhere, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was quite ready to say so out loud. You have been solving my problem, he said. His voice had something in it she had not heard before. Not quite anger, not quite gratitude. Something that existed in the territory between those two things. I have been solving our problem, she said. There is a difference. The words settled between them. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached out and put his hand over hers where it rested on the porch railing, and she felt the warmth of it move up her arm, and she did not pull away. They stood like that until the sun moved and the light changed and the evening came on, and neither of them said anything else, and neither of them needed to. Crane went to Reverend Greer that same afternoon. Emmeline was not present for the conversation. She did not need to be. Greer was the kind of man who understood the difference between a statement made from integrity and one made under duress, but who also understood that a community needed the public correction more than it needed the private virtue of the man providing it. By the following evening, the shape of what Crane had said about Emmeline Voss had been replaced in the town's understanding by what Greer had said in correction. Crane left on Saturday morning. Emmeline watched his horse disappear down the road from the front porch and felt something she could not immediately name. Not triumph, something quieter than that, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding a defensive position for a long time and has finally been given permission to stand down. Something old and heavy setting itself down at last. She stood on the porch until the road had been empty for several minutes. Then she went inside and took the tin from her room and brought it downstairs and put it on Garrett's desk. She left a note beside it written in her careful hand. It said, "This is for the tax debt. I have the accounting in the notebook. What I have collected is short by $11. I will have the remainder by the end of next month. I did not tell you I was doing this because I knew you would object. You can object now if you want. It will not change the accounting." She went to the barn to check on Whitmore, whose arm had healed cleanly and who was back at full work, but whom she still examined monthly because she had told him she would. She was in the barn when she heard Garrett come in from the house. She knew his step. She had learned it without deciding to learn it the way you learn the particular sounds of a house you have lived in long enough. She finished with Whitmore's arm, told him the range of motion was good and the healing was complete, and that she would not need to see him again unless something new developed. Whitmore thanked her briefly and with sincerity, and then made himself occupied with something on the far side of the barn. Garrett was in the doorway. She turned around. He was holding the tin in one hand and the note in the other, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not anger, not the contained gratitude of a man who had accepted help he would rather not have needed. Something that had several things in it at once and had not yet settled into whichever one was going to lead. "You have been doing this since April," he said. "Since the first week of April, yes. Without telling me. I told you why in the note." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the tin, looking at the note, looking at the floor between them. "Emmeline." The way he said her name had changed since February. She had noticed this without remarking on it. It had lost the formality of the early weeks. Something additional was in it now. "I owe you more than I know how to say." "You do not owe me anything," she said. "That is not why I did it." He looked up at her. She held his gaze. "I did it because this ranch is my home now, because what is yours is mine and what is mine is yours, and that is what we agreed to when we signed the contract, even if neither of us knew quite what that would mean at the time." She paused. "I did it because I wanted to." He set the tin and the note on the barn post beside him. He stood in the barn doorway and looked at her with that uncontained face, the one she had first seen on the Pierce porch and had been watching surface more and more often since then. And the distance between them was 3 feet, and it was the last 3 feet of a journey that had been taking 5 months to complete. She had been waiting for him to close it. She understood in this moment that he was waiting for her. She crossed the distance. She put her hand against the side of his face, the way she put her hands on everything that mattered, with full attention and without hesitation, and he put his hand over hers and held it there, and looked at her with an openness that she had not known his face was capable of until this moment. "I do not know how to do this anymore," he said. His voice was rough in the way of something that had not been used in too long. 4 years is a long time to be without practice at anything. "No one does it right," she said. "That is not what it requires. I do not want to do it wrong by you." "You already know how to show up," she said. "You have been doing it since November. Everything else we will figure out." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he leaned forward and touched his forehead to hers, and they stood like that in the barn in the April afternoon with the horses quiet in their stalls, and the light coming in through the gaps in the boards in long, flat lines, and Whitmore very occupied with something that required him to go outside. When he kissed her, it was the kiss of a man relearning a language he had thought he had forgotten. Careful at first, and then not careful. Tentative at first, and then not tentative. She kissed him back without reservation because she had done her thinking, and she had arrived at her conclusion, and she was not a woman who reconsidered decisions made in good faith with full information. That evening he stood in the hallway. She came out of the kitchen and found him there standing in front of the closed door with his back to her, not moving. She stopped. She did not speak. She understood what this was, and she understood it required only her presence, not her words. He stood there for a while. Then he reached out and unhooked the latch. The door opened. The room inside was small and neat, with the quality of a space that had been tended without being inhabited, dusted and maintained by a man who could not enter it without cost and had chosen to pay that cost rather than let it fall into neglect. There was a dress form in the corner, a small writing desk with a chair, a shelf of books, a portrait on the wall painted by someone competent, if not exceptional, of a woman with dark hair and steady eyes and hands folded in her lap. Emmeline looked at the portrait. She looked at the hands. She understood what Fletcher had meant that first week in the barn. She understood it with the particular clarity of someone who has just received the last piece of information that makes a long sequence of smaller observations cohere into a whole. She stepped into the room and stood beside Garrett, and they both looked at the portrait, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Her name was Margaret, he said finally. His voice was rough, but it was present, not retreating. He was speaking directly into the thing rather than around it for the first time in 4 years. She died 6 hours after the birth. Our son did not survive either. He stopped. He kept going. I have not said those sentences out loud in 4 years. I know, she said. I brought you here thinking I wanted a practical arrangement, thinking I was finished with anything beyond practical. He looked at the portrait, and his face was fully unguarded now, without the dark and cold to partially conceal it. I was wrong about that. She did not fill the silence after that. She let it be what it needed to be. After a while, he reached out and gently pulled the door toward closed. Then he paused. He did not latch it. He left it slightly open, a finger's width of light from the hallway falling across the floor inside, and turned and looked at Emmeline. I spent 4 years keeping that door latched, he said. I think I am done with that. I think you are too, she said. The tax debt was resolved in May, not solely by the money in the tin, though the tin brought it close enough that a conversation with the bank in Missoula and a reasonable payment arrangement covered the remainder. Garrett made the trip himself. He came back and told Emmeline it was handled in the practical tone he used for solved things, and she nodded and went back to what she was doing. But she noticed that he put his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed through the kitchen, and the hand stayed there for a moment before he moved on. She filed this in the part of herself that was slowly filling with a different kind of inventory than the one she had arrived with. Summer came properly in June. The ranch became a different place in summer. The mountains lost their snow caps by degrees, the high meadows opening to graze. The days were long in the specific luxury of Montana summer light until 9 and 10 at night, the sky doing things in those long evenings that Emmeline tried twice to describe in letters to her cousin in Philadelphia, and gave up both times. Some things required presence. She delivered 7 babies that summer. She lost none of them. She lost one mother in July to a hemorrhage she could not stop, despite everything she had learned and everything she had available to her. A young woman named Clara Marsh, 20 years old, who held Emmeline's hand at the end with a grip that Emmeline would feel in her own hand for a long time after. She came home from the Marsh farm at 2 in the morning, and Garrett was awake, and he did not say anything. He simply made room for her at the kitchen table and sat with her in the lamplight while she came back from it slowly, the way you come back from those things when you cannot afford not to. That was the night she understood completely what she had in him. Not the gestures, not even the willingness to sit in a difficult silence without filling it. It was the quality of his attention. The way he was fully present and required nothing from her in return for that presence. She had known people who offered comfort as a transaction, who needed acknowledgement of their comfort in order to continue providing it. Garrett offered it the way he did most things, without performance, because it needed doing and he was there to do it. She thought about her grandmother. The old woman had told her once near the end of her life that there were two kinds of people in the world: people who moved toward difficulty and people who moved away from it. Neither kind was better in all situations, she had said. But if you were in the business of helping people through hard things, you wanted to build your life around people who moved toward. Garrett Hale moved toward. He always had. She told him in August. It was a Sunday. The morning was clear and very warm by Montana standards, the light early, and direct, the kind of morning that felt like an argument for the specific value of this place on earth. They had come back from checking the north fence together, riding side by side in the early morning, and the return to the ranch had taken longer than necessary because neither of them had been in a hurry. In the kitchen, she made coffee and then stood at the window with the cup in her hands and said it. "I am pregnant." She said it to the window because she wanted to say it first and then be able to turn and see his face rather than say it directly into his face while he was processing it. She turned. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen. He had set his coffee cup down behind him on the table without looking at it. He was looking at her, and his face was doing something she had never seen it do. She had seen it contained and controlled. She had seen it in the process of opening, the slow, careful work of a man dismantling what he had built from grief. She had seen it on the Pierce porch and in Margaret's room, and in the quiet evenings of the summer they had made together from unpromising materials. She had not seen this. His face was entirely uncontained. It had released every managed thing and was simply showing her what was in it without editing. There was fear in it. She had expected that, given Margaret, given what pregnancy meant in this man's specific history. There was wonder in it, the kind that comes to people who have stopped expecting certain things and then encounter them anyway. And there was something else, something that lived in the territory past the fear and past the wonder, that seemed to be the emotion that arrives when all the others have moved through, and what remains is simply the raw fact of a feeling too large for ordinary containers. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she felt him breathe one long breath against her hair, and then she felt his shoulders move with something she recognized as crying, although she had not known until this moment that he was capable of it, or that it would feel like this, like a structure giving way that had been holding an enormous weight for a very long time. She put her arms around him and held on. He collected himself within a minute, pulling back and looking at the ceiling briefly in the way of a man waiting for his face to return to his own jurisdiction. Then he looked at her. His eyes were still not entirely his own. "I thought," he said, and stopped. "I know what you thought," she said. He reached out very carefully and put his hand against her abdomen, the same quality of care he had used the first night in the hallway and the first afternoon in the barn. Trying not to break what mattered, she put her hand over his. "You are going to be fine," she said. "Both of you. I have more knowledge about this than any doctor in 40 miles, and I intend to use every bit of it." She held his gaze. "This is not what happened before." He looked at her. "I know that is not a promise I can make from outside the outcome," she said. "But it is what the evidence says, and I am a person who reads evidence carefully." She kept her eyes on his. "Trust the evidence." He was quiet for a long moment. "I trust you," he said, which was the same thing, and both of them knew it. In September, a letter arrived from Philadelphia, from Dorothea Marsh, in response to the letter Emmeline had sent in March. Dorothea had spent the intervening months gathering what she could gather, and what she had gathered was considerable. The letter contained signed, notarized statements from 4 women, all describing the same pattern in the same sufficient detail. It contained a copy of a formal complaint lodged with the Philadelphia Business Association. It contained the name and address of a magistrate who had agreed to receive additional documentation. Emmeline read the letter at the kitchen table. She sat with it for a while. Then she wrote back to Dorothea Marsh and thanked her and described what had happened in Crest Haven, and she copied the relevant portions to Reverend Greer, and she added her own signed statement and sent the complete document to the Philadelphia magistrate. She did not know what would come of it. She knew that men like Crane were difficult to hold formally accountable, that the systems designed to constrain them had been largely built by people who resembled them. But a record existed now and would continue to exist, and the women who had made it had paid something to make it, and the payment deserved to be sent where it might eventually matter. She put the notebook away in her bag and folded her hands on the table and sat in the quiet of the September kitchen and felt something conclude. Not finished exactly. These things were never finished in the clean way, but resolved, set down in the permanent record where it would remain. She did not think she would need the notebook in the same way anymore. The baby came in October, a girl, 7 pounds healthy and loud from her first breath, with dark hair and gray eyes that seemed in the first hours to be taking in the world with a seriousness that Emmeline found immediately recognizable. Vera attended the birth because Emmeline had asked her, and because having someone she trusted in the room was one of the few concessions she made to her own vulnerability in the matter. Garrett was in the house. He had offered to be in the room, and she had told him with equal parts firmness and affection that she needed to concentrate, and he would be a problem for her concentration, and he had accepted this without offense, in the way of a man who had learned to receive what she actually said rather than looking for a different answer behind it. She heard him outside the door throughout. She knew his step. She had always known his step. After, when Vera had helped her and the baby was wrapped, she told Vera to send him in. He came in quietly. He stood beside the bed and looked at his daughter, and then looked at Emmeline, and his face did that fully unguarded thing that she had come to know as its most honest expression. She put the baby in his arms. He held her with the specific steadiness of a man who knew his own strength and was vigilant about it with delicate things. The baby looked up at him from the first world that newborns inhabit. He looked back. Neither of them moved for a long moment. "She has your hands," he said. Emmeline looked. The baby's hands were small and open, unclenched, in the way newborn hands are unclenched, as if already reaching towards something. "Good," Emmeline said. "She will use them." They named her Ruth, not after anyone, after the quality itself, after the word that meant the kind of steadiness that persists when everything around it is changing. Emmeline had suggested it. Garrett had considered it in the way he considered anything that mattered longer than most people expected and shorter than it sometimes seemed. And then he had said yes. Ruth Hale arrived in the world in October of 1884, and the world, as it does with all arrivals, rearranged itself slightly to accommodate her. The winter of 1884 was the first winter Emmeline did not experience primarily as something to be endured. She noticed it as a fact, as a set of conditions requiring response and management. The cold was the same cold, the work was the same work, but the quality of it had changed in the way that the quality of a space changes when the furniture has been moved to where it belongs. The same objects, different arrangement. Suddenly the space makes sense in a way it did not before. She delivered 3 babies that winter. She lost none of them. The tax on the ranch was paid and stayed paid because the summer had been good and because Emmeline's income had become a real second line that she handled with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. Fletcher married in the spring, a woman from a family north of town who had the same brusque directness as Emmeline herself, and who they all agreed was more than Fletcher deserved and exactly what he needed. Whitmore used his healed arm without trouble. Reverend Greer preached a sermon in February that was ostensibly about the importance of not mistaking a person's origins for their character, and which the town received in the various ways that congregations receive sermons that are about something specific while claiming to be about something general. The ranch grew. 17 years is a long time. It is long enough for a woman who arrived in a storm to become someone the land knows. Long enough for the town that had once whispered about her to have been partially replaced by people who had no memory of the whispers and knew her only as the woman who had brought them or their children or their grandchildren into the world. Long enough for the room in the hallway to be opened and aired and eventually turned into something useful. A study where Ruth did her lessons in the evenings by lamplight. The portrait of Margaret still on the wall, but no longer sealed behind a closed door. No longer a thing to be protected from, simply a woman who had lived and mattered and was honored by being remembered rather than by being locked away. Ruth Hale grew up in the specific way of children raised on working land, with a sense of her own competence. That was not arrogance, but simply the accurate self-assessment of someone who had been allowed to do real things and discover what she was made of. She had her mother's hands. She had her father's stillness in difficult situations. She had Fletcher's laugh, which had migrated generationally without biological justification. She had something of her own that neither parent fully recognized as coming from them, because it was the particular combination of the two of them the quality that comes when a careful man and a determined woman raise a child in a house full of honest work and genuine affection. By the time she was 17, she had been present at more than a dozen births. Initially as an observer, then as an assistant, finally as the person Emmeline relied on when she needed an additional set of skilled hands. Ruth learned without being taught explicitly because she had grown up watching her mother learn, and she understood that learning was simply the practice of paying sustained attention to things that mattered. It was Ruth who found the letter. It was the autumn of 1901, the October of her 17th year, 17 years after the October her mother had arrived in this country. Ruth was helping Emmeline clear out the study, the room that had been Margaret's room, making space for new shelving to hold the expanding collection of medical texts that had accumulated over nearly 2 decades. They were going through the writing desk in the corner, sorting old papers and correspondence, and the accumulated small documents of a life, and Ruth was working through the bottom drawer while Emmeline worked on the shelf above. The letter was at the very back of the bottom drawer, beneath a shallow false bottom that Ruth discovered only because the drawer sat wrong when she tried to close it, slightly proud on the left side, and when she investigated, she found the thin panel and lifted it. The letter lay beneath it, folded twice, sealed with a plain wax impression. She turned it over. The handwriting on the outside was unfamiliar to her. The date at the top when she unfolded it was October 1882, a full year before her mother had arrived. She read it. It was the letter Garrett had sent to the placement agency in Philadelphia. His original draft kept in the desk in this room in the drawer with the false bottom for 17 years. The formal language of the arrangement, the description of the ranch, the practical expectations. His signature at the bottom, Garrett Hale, age 43, widower, in his large, unhurried hand. And then beneath the signature in handwriting that was slightly different from the body of the letter, slightly more uneven, added after a pause by a man alone at a desk in a quiet house, who was deciding whether to include this or not, and who had decided in the end that honesty even toward a stranger was a kind of dignity he was not willing to surrender. He had written, "I am not looking for love. I have been told that is the expected pretense of a letter such as this. I find I cannot write it. But if Providence sees fit to send something I did not know to ask for, I will not turn it away." Ruth read it twice. She sat with it for a moment, understanding arriving in layers. This was his copy, his draft, kept in this desk, in this room, in the room he had locked because he could not enter it and now could not stop entering because it was his daughter's study, the room where every evening Ruth sat beneath the portrait of a woman with dark hair and steady hands and did her lessons by lamplight. He had kept it here because this was the room he kept things that mattered, because this was where Margaret had lived, and this was where the letter had been written, and this was where he had sat on an October evening in 1882, not looking for love, and honest enough to say so, and honest enough also to leave the door open in case something arrived that he did not know to look for. Ruth looked at her mother. Emmeline had stopped what she was doing. She was looking at the letter in her daughter's hands with the expression Ruth had come to know well over 17 years of watching her mother's face, the expression that appeared in the late evening, sometimes when the house was quiet and Garrett was on the porch, and Emmeline stood at the kitchen window watching him and thought he could not see her doing it. The expression that had no name Ruth could find for it, except that it looked like a person seeing something they had not expected to still find beautiful after so many years of knowing it. "Did you know he wrote this?" Ruth said. "I did not." Ruth looked at the letter again, at the 2 lines at the bottom, at the date at the top, at the room they were sitting in, the room that had once been sealed against grief and was now full of books and lamplight and the small daily evidence of a family that had grown here without any of them fully noticing the moment it became inevitable. "You should show him," Ruth said. "I know," her mother said. Ruth put the letter on the desk. She went outside. The autumn air was cold in the specific way of Montana October, carrying the intention of winter without yet committing to it, and the light on the mountains to the west was the amber of late afternoon in this season that Ruth had grown up under and could not imagine being without. She had thought about leaving sometimes the way young people thought about leaving, turning the idea over and setting it down, measuring it against what she would be leaving for and what she would be leaving behind. She had never been able to make the arithmetic work in favor of leaving. She was beginning to understand why. Her horse was at the fence. She had named him Storm when she was 6 years old for reasons that had made complete sense to her at 6, and that she understood now with a different and deeper completeness. Her mother had smiled at the name and said nothing, and Ruth had filed that away as she filed everything away for the time when she would have enough context to understand what the smile had meant. She understood it now. She understood all of it now. She put her hand on Storm's nose and looked at the mountains and thought about a woman arriving in a blizzard with a black bag in her grandmother's hands and a name she signed without embellishment or plea. Emmeline Voss, here is what I am. Here is what I can do. Take it or leave it. The town had taken it. The land had taken it. Her father had taken it slowly and at considerable cost to his defenses, and he had been grateful for the difficulty ever since because the things that had cost the most had turned out to be worth exactly that. Inside the house, Emmeline took the letter from the desk and walked down the hallway and through the kitchen and out the back door where she could see Garrett through the screen standing on the porch in the October light, looking at the mountains the way he had always looked at them, the look of a man who had lived long enough in a hard place to understand that the landscape did not need his approval and was not waiting for it, and that this was not indifference but its own form of honesty. She pushed open the door. He turned. She held out the letter. He looked at it. He looked at her face. He reached out and took it from her and unfolded it in the way he handled papers carefully, with the attention of someone who had learned that paper could contain things worth treating with respect. He read it. She watched his face while he read. She had been watching his face for 17 years, and she was still learning it, still finding in it things she had not seen before, which she had come to believe was one of the primary indicators of a life well spent. That the person across from you continued to surprise you with their depth, continued to offer new rooms in themselves that you had not known were there. His face reading those 2 lines at the bottom of a letter he had written at a desk in an empty house 19 years ago was doing something she would not have words for later when she tried to describe it even to herself. It was the face of a man receiving a message he had sent without expectation of delivery, finding it returned to him with all the evidence of what had arrived in answer. He read it twice, he folded it. He stood on the porch of the house he had built from grief and then rebuilt from something else, the house that had grown around a family he had stopped believing he would have, and he held the letter in his hands and looked out at the mountains going dark by degrees in the west and said nothing for a long time. Then he held out his hand. She took it. They stood on the porch together as the October evening came on, the mountains going from amber to purple to dark, the first stars appearing one at a time in the east, the way they always did in this part of Montana, patient and unhurried, each one present, before you noticed it was there. The ranch settled into its evening sounds around them, familiar and ongoing, the sounds of a life that had been built from unpromising materials and maintained by daily intention over 17 years of difficult winters and good summers, and all the ordinary, extraordinary days between. From the fence below the porch, they could hear Ruth talking to her horse in the way she had talked to horses since she was small, one-sided, and completely serious, as though the horse had opinions worth considering, and the conversation was genuine. Garrett and Emmeline both listened to this without comment because they had been listening to it for years, and it had never stopped being one of their favorite sounds. From inside the house came the lamplight coming on in the study window. Ruth having come back in and settled at the desk for her evening work, the warm rectangle of it falling out across the porch boards between where Emmeline and Garrett stood. The letter was in Garrett's coat pocket. His hand was around hers. The mountains were dark now, and the stars were fully out, hard and bright and cold above Hale Ranch. The same stars that had watched the storm come in 17 years ago. The same stars that had watched a woman walk a mile in a blizzard with a black bag and no certainty and an absolute refusal to wait by the side of the road for someone else to come along. Emmeline looked at the stars and thought about the woman she had been when she arrived. 22 years old and frightened in ways she had been too proud to admit, and running from something without being sure yet what she was running toward. She thought about that woman with something that was neither pity nor distance, but a kind of clear-eyed recognition. That woman had done the hard parts, had made the choices before she knew what they would pist or what they would return, had signed her name to an uncertain thing and kept her word and stayed. She had delivered hundreds of babies in 17 years, had stood in the crucial moments of hundreds of lives and done what she could with what she had. had lost some of them, as every person who does that work eventually loses some of them, and had carried those losses the way you carry them, which was forward, which was the only direction available. She had built something here, a practice, a home, a family, a life that had grown past the dimensions of anything she had imagined when she knocked on a stranger's door in a snowstorm and waited to see if he would step back. He had stepped back. She had come in. Everything else had followed from those two small acts. No regrets, Garrett said after a while. He asked her this sometimes in these quiet evenings, not because he doubted the answer, but because the asking was its own kind of thing, a ritual of acknowledgement, a way of saying out loud what was too large to say in any other form. Not a single one, she said. The same answer she always gave. The same answer she always meant. You should have, he said with the dry humor he had developed slowly over the years, the humor that was entirely his own, and that she loved, particularly because he had not had it when she arrived, had built it in the years since, from the materials of a life that was finally giving him reasons to use it. Why is that? Storm damage to the north barn. It is going to be a long winter. She turned her head and looked at him in the starlight. You had me for a moment. He looked back at her with that face, the fully present and unmanaged face, the one that was only hers. I know, he said. I have been getting better at that. You have, she agreed. She leaned into him slightly, the way she had learned to lean into things in this part of the world, not surrendering her own weight, but allowing someone else to share it, which was different, and which it had taken her a long time to learn, was not the same as weakness, but was in fact its own form of strength. The stars went on above them, and the ranch went on below them, and inside the house Ruth Hale sat at the desk that had once held a letter for 17 years, and studied by the same lamplight that had always burned in this room, and outside at the fence, storm shifted and was quiet, and the night came fully on, in the way Montana nights came on in October, completely and without apology, with all the stars it had to offer and all the cold it was prepared to give, and all the particular dark beauty that only belonged to a place that did not require your approval of it to go on being what it was. Emmeline Voss, who had walked a mile in a blizzard with nothing but her grandmother's hands and her grandmother's bag, and the refusal to wait by the side of the road for someone to come along, had arrived at a life she had not known to ask for. She held on to it the way she had been trained to hold on to things that mattered, with both hands, with full attention, without letting go.